Welcome, Wapham crew, guys, gals, ghouls, friends, fiends, foes, whoever may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high, sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. It is Sunday, February 23rd, Monday, February 24th for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and thanks so much for joining me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. If you're listening live right now, you may be listening to us on KPNL Radio, which you can find at KPNL Radio at kpnl-db.com. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch under We Are Paradox Media. If you don't mind, mosey on over to our YouTube, like, subscribe, leave us any comments, whether good or bad, on any episode that you've watched. And we're about done with this book here, the Stephen King Insomnia book, so put something in there. What book would you like me to pick up next? And that being said, it is story time. We are going to finish this book tonight. I figured after we do that, we'll get into some online stories, maybe some skinwalker stories or something like that. I don't know. We'll find something. Just life going on as it always does, which is, so to say, mostly between the lines and outside the margins. What happens while we're making other plans, according to some sage or other, and if life was exceptionally good to Ralph Roberts during those years, it might have been because he had no other plans to make. He maintained friendships with Joe Weiser and John Lydecker, but his best friend during those years was his wife. They went almost everywhere together, had no secrets, and fought so seldom one might just as well have never said. He also had Rosalie the Beagle, the rocker, and had once been Mr. Chase's, and was now his, and almost daily visits from Natalie, who had begun calling them Ralph and Lois instead of Ralph and Lois. A change neither of them found to be an improvement. He was wealthy, which was maybe the best thing of all. It was just life, full of short-time rewards and setbacks. And Ralph lived it with enjoyment and serenity until mid-March of 1998, when he awoke one morning, glanced at the digital clock beside his bed, and saw it was 5:49 a.m. He lay quietly beside Lois, not wanting to disturb her by getting up, and wondering what had awakened him. "You know what, Ralph?" "No, I don't." "Yes, you do. Listen." So he listened. He listened very carefully, and after a while he began to hear it in the walls, the low, soft ticking of the death watch. Section 9. Ralph awoke at 5:47 the following morning, and at 5:44 the morning after that. His sleep was whittled away minute by minute as winter slowly loosened its grip on Derry and allowed spring to come find its way back in. By May he was hearing the tick of the death watch everywhere, but understood it was all coming from one place and simply projecting itself, as a good ventriloquist can project his voice. Before it had been coming from Carolyn, now it was coming from him. He felt none of the terror that had gripped him when he'd been so sure that he'd developed cancer, and none of the desperation he vaguely remembered from his previous bout of insomnia. He tired more easily and began to find it more difficult to concentrate and remember even simple things, but he accepted what was happening calmly. "Are you sleeping all right, Ralph?" Lois asked him one day. "You're getting these big dark circles under your eyes." "It's the dope I take," Ralph said. "Very funny, you old poop." He took her arms, wrapped them around her, and hugged her. "Don't worry about me, sweetheart. I'm getting all the sleep I need." He awoke one morning at A week later at 4:02 a.m., with a line of deep heat throbbing in his arm, throbbing in perfect sync with the sound of the death watch, which was, of course, nothing more or less than the beat of his own heart. But this new thing wasn't his heart, or at least Ralph didn't think it was. It felt as if an electric filament had been embedded in the flesh of his forearm. It's the scar, he thought, and then, no, it's the promise. The time of the promise is almost here. What promise, Ralph? What promise? He didn't know. Section 10. One day in early June, Helen and Nat flew in to visit and tell Ralph and Lois about the trip they had taken to Boston with Aunt Melanie, a bank teller with whom Helen had become close friends. Helen and Aunt Melanie had gone to some sort of feminist convention with Natalie, networking with about 1 billion new kids in the daycare center, and then Aunt Melanie had left to do some more feminist things in New York and Washington. Helen and Nat had stayed on in Boston for a couple of days, just sightseeing. We went to see a movie cartoon, Natalie said. It was about animals in the woods. They talked. She pronounced this last word with Shakespearean grandiosity. Talked. Movies where animals talk are neat, aren't they? Lois asked. My beautiful sister Sandra. Yes, also, I got this new dress. And a very pretty dress it is, Lois said. Helen was looking at Ralph. Are you okay, old chum? You look pale and you haven't said boo. Never better, he said. I was just thinking how cute you two look in those caps. Did you get them at Fenway Park? Both Helen and Nat were wearing Boston Red Sox caps. These were common enough in New England during warm weather. Common as cat dirt, Lois would have said. But the sight of them on the heads of these two people filled Ralph with some deep, resonant feeling. And it was tied to a specific image, one he did not in the least understand. The front of the Red Apple store. Helen, meantime, had taken off her hat and was examining it. Yes, she said, we went, but we only stayed for 3 innings. Men hitting balls and catching balls. I guess I just don't have much patience for men and their balls these days. But we like our nifty boss hats, don't we, Natalie? Yes, Nat agreed smartly. And when Ralph awoke the next morning at 4:01, the scar throbbing his thin line of heat inside his arm, and the death watch seemed almost to have gained a voice. One whispered a strange foreign-sounding name over and over. Atropus. 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 I know that name. Do you, Ralph? Yes, he was the one with the rusty scalpel and the nasty disposition. The one who called me Shorts. The one who took what, Ralph? I was getting used to these silent discussions. They seemed to come to him on some mental radio band, a pirate frequency which operated only during the little hours, the ones when he lay awake beside his sleeping wife, waiting for the sun to come up. Took what? Do you remember? He didn't expect to. The questions that voice asked him almost always went unanswered. This time, unexpectedly, an answer came. Bill McGovern's hat, of course. Atropus took Bill's hat, and once I made him so mad, he actually took a bite out of the brim. Who is he? Who is Atropus? Of this he was not so sure. He only knew that Atropus had something to do with Helen, who now owned a Boston Red Sox cap, of which she seemed very fond, and that he had a rusty scalpel. Soon, thought Ralph Roberts as he lay in the dark, listening to the soft, steady tick of the death watch in the walls. I'll know soon. Section 11. During the 3rd week of that baking hot June, Ralph began to see the auras again. Section 12. As June slipped into July, Ralph found himself bursting into tears often, usually for no discernible reason at all. It was strange. He had no sense of depression or discontent, but sometimes he would look at something, maybe only a bird winging its solitary way across the sky, and his heart would vibrate with sorrow and loss. "It's almost over," the inside voice said. It no longer belonged to Carolyn or Bill or even his own younger self. It was all its own now, the voice of a stranger, although not necessarily an unkind one. "That's why you're sad, Ralph. It's perfectly normal to be sad as things start to wind down." "Nothing's almost over," he cried back. "Why should it be? At my last checkup, Dr. Pickard said I was sound as a drum and fine, never better." Silence from the voice inside, but it was a knowing silence. Section 13. "Okay," Ralph said out loud one hot afternoon near the end of July. He was sitting on a bench not far from the place where the dairy standpipe had stood until 1985. When the big storm had come along and knocked it down, at the base of the hill near the bird bath, a young man, a serious bird watcher from the binoculars he wore and the thick stack of paperbacks on the grass beside him, was making careful notes in what looked like some sort of journal. "Okay, tell me why it's almost over. Just tell me that." There was no immediate answer, but that was all right. Ralph was willing to wait. It had been quite a stroll over here. The day was hot and he was tired. He was now waking around 3:30 every morning. He had begun taking long walks again, but not in any hope they would help him sleep better or longer. He thought he was making pilgrimages, visiting all his favorite spots in Derry one last time, saying goodbye. "Because the time of the promise has almost come," the voice answered, and the scar began to throb with its deep, narrow heat again. "The one that was made to you, and the one you made in return." "What was it?" he asked, agitated. "Please, if I made a promise, why can't I remember what it was?" The serious birdwatcher heard that and looked up the hill. What he saw was a man sitting on a park bench, and apparently having a "come on, let's go while there's still shade on this side of the—" She trailed off. The little smile she had been wearing slipped off her face. It was replaced by a look of dismay. In the gray of her aura, which had only darkened slightly during the years Ralph hadn't been able to see it, now began to glow with flocks of reddish-pink embers. "Ralph, what's wrong? What are you really going to do?" "Nothing," he said, but the scar was glowing inside his arm, and the tick of the death watch was everywhere, loud and everywhere. It was telling him he had an appointment to keep, a promise to keep. "Yes, there is, and it's been wrong for the last 2 or 3 months, maybe longer. I'm a foolish woman. I knew something was happening, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it dead on, because I was afraid. And I was right to be afraid, wasn't I? I was right. Lois." He was suddenly crossing the room to him, crossing fast, almost leaping, the old back injury not slowing her down in the least, and before he could stop her, he had seized his right arm and was holding it out, looking at it fixedly. The scar was glowing a fierce bright red. Ralph had a moment to hope that it was strictly an aural glow and she wouldn't be able to see it. Then she looked up, eyes round and full of terror. Terror and something else. Ralph thought that something else was recognition. "Oh my God," she whispered. "The men in the park, the ones with the funny names, clothes and lashes, something like that. And one of them cut you. Oh, Ralph, oh my God, what are you supposed to do?" "Now, Lois, don't you dare tell me not to take on," she shrieked into his face. Don't you dare. "Hurry," the interior voice whispered. "You don't have time to stand around and discuss this. Somewhere it's already begun to happen, and the death watch you hear may not be ticking just for you. I have to go." He turned and blundered toward the door. In his agitation, he did not notice a certain Sherlock Holmesian circumstance attending his scene. A dog which should have barked, a dog which always barked, her stern disapproval when voices were raised by the screen door, and the door itself was standing ajar. Rosalie was the furthest thing from Ralph's mind at the moment. He felt knee-deep in molasses and thought he would be doing well just to make the porch, let alone the red apple up the street. His heart thumped and skidded in his chest. His eyes were burning. "No!" Lois screamed. "No, Ralph, please, please don't leave." He ran after him, clutched his arm. She was still holding her paintbrush, and the fine red droplets which splattered his shirt looked like blood. Now she was crying, and her expression of utter, abject sorrow nearly broke his heart. He didn't want to leave her like this. Wasn't sure he could leave her like this. He turned and took her by her forearms. "Lois, I have to go." "You haven't been sleeping," she blabbed. "I knew that, and I knew it meant something was wrong, but it doesn't matter. We'll go away. We can leave right now, this minute. We'll just take Rosalie and our toothbrushes and go." He squeezed her arms, and she stopped, looking at him with her wet eyes. Her lips were trembling. "Lois, listen to me. I have to do this." "I lost Paul. I can't lose you too," she wailed. "I couldn't stand it. Oh, Ralph, I couldn't stand it." "You'll be able to," he thought. "Short-timers are a lot tougher than they look." They have to be. Ralph felt a couple of tears trickle down his cheeks. He suspected their source was more weariness than grief. If he could make her see that all this changed nothing, only made what he had to do harder. He held her at arm's length. The scar on his arm was throbbing more fiercely than ever, and the feeling of time slipping relentlessly away had become overwhelming. "Walk with me at least part way if you want," he said. "Maybe you can even help me do what I have to do. I've had my life, Lois, and a fine one it was, but she hasn't really had anything yet, and I'll be damned if I'll let that son of a bitch have her, just because he's got a score to settle with me." "What son of a bitch, Ralph? What in the world are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Natalie Dipnew. He's supposed to die this morning. Only I'm not going to let that happen." "Nat? Ralph, why would anyone want to hurt Nat?" She looked very bewildered, very our Lois. But wasn't there something else beneath that daffy exterior? Something careful and calculating? Ralph thought the answer was yes. Ralph had an idea Lois wasn't half as bewildered as she was pretending to be. She had fooled Bill McGovern for years with that act, him too, at least part of the time, and this was just another, and rather brilliant, variation of the same old scam. What she was really trying to do was hold him here. She loved Nat deeply, but to Lois, a choice between her husband and the little girl who lived up the lane was no choice at all. She didn't consider either age or questions of fairness to have any bearing on the situation. But Ralph was her man, and to Lois, that was all that mattered. "It won't work," he said, not unkindly. He disengaged himself and started for the door again. "I made a promise, and I'm all out of time." "Break it then," she cried, and the mixture of terror and rage in her voice stunned him. "I don't remember much about that time, but I remember we got involved with things that almost got us killed, and for reasons we couldn't even understand, so break it, Ralph. Better your promise than my heart." "And what about the kid? What about Helen, for that matter? That's all she lives for. Doesn't Helen deserve something better from me than a broken promise?" "I don't care what she deserves, what any of them deserve," she shouted, and then her face crumpled. "Yes, all right, I suppose I do, but what about us, Ralph? Don't we count?" Her eyes, those dark and eloquent Spanish eyes of hers, pleaded with him. If he looked into them long enough, it would become all too easy to cry it off, so Ralph looked away. "I mean to do it, honey. Nat's going to get what you and I have already had, another 70 years or so of days and nights." She looked at him helplessly, but made no attempt to stop him again. Instead, she began to cry. "Foolish old man," she whispered. "Foolish, willful old man." "Yes, I suppose," he said, and lifted her chin. "But I'm a foolish, willful old man of my word. Come with me. I'd like that. All right, Ralph. She could hardly hear her own voice, and her skin was as cold as clay. Her aura had gone almost completely red. What is it? What's going to happen to her? She's going to be hit by a green Ford sedan, unless I take her place. She's going to be splashed all over Harris Avenue, and Helen's going to see it happen. Section 16. As they walked up the hill toward the Red Apple, at first Lois kept falling behind, then trying to catch up, but she quit when she saw she could not slow him with such a simple trick. Ralph told her what little more he could do. He had some memory of being under the lightning-struck tree out by the extension. A memory she had believed, at least until this morning, to be a memory of a dream. But of course she hadn't been there during Ralph's final confrontation with Atropos. Ralph told her of it now, of the random death Atropos intended Natalie to suffer if Ralph continued standing in the way of his plans. He told her of how he'd extracted a promise from Clotho and Lachesis that Atropos might in this case be overruled and Nat saved. I have an idea that the decision was made very near the top of this crazy building, this tower. They kept talking about maybe at the very top. He was panting out of words and his heart was beating more rapidly than ever, but he thought most of that could be attributed to the fast walk and the torrid day. His fear subsided somewhat. Talking to Lois had done that much. Now he could see the Red Apple. Mrs. Perrine was at the bus stop half a block farther up, standing straight as a general reviewing troops. Her net shopping bag hung over her arm. There was a bus shelter nearby, and it was shady inside, but Mrs. Perrine stolidly ignored its existence. Even in the dazzling sunlight, he could see that her aura was the same, West Point gray as it had been on the October evening in 1993. Of Helen and Nat, there was as yet no sign. Section 17. Of course I knew who he was, Esther Perrine later tells the reporter from the Dairy News. Do I look incompetent to you, young man? Or senile? I've known Ralph Roberts for over 20 years. A good man, not cut from the same cloth as his first wife, of course. Carolyn was a Satterweight from the Bangor Satterweights, but a very fine man just the same. I recognized the driver of that green Ford auto, too, right away. Pete Sullivan delivered my paper for 6 years, and he did a good job. The new one, the Morrison boy, always throws it in my flower beds or up on the porch roof. Pete was driving with his mother on his learner's permit. I understand, and I hope he won't take on too much about what happened, for he's a good lad, and it really wasn't his fault. I saw the whole thing, and I'll take my oath on it. I suppose you think I'm rambling. Don't bother denying it, and I can read your face just like it was your own newspaper. Never mind, though. I've said most of what I have to say. I knew it was Ralph right away, but something you'll get wrong even if you put it in your story, which you probably won't. He came from nowhere to save that little girl. Esther Perrine fixes the respectfully silent young reporter with a formidable glance. Fixes him as a podopterist might fix a butterfly or on a pin after administering the chloroform. I don't mean it was like he came from nowhere, young man, although I bet that's what you'll print. He leans toward the reporter, her eyes never leaving his face, and says it again. He came from nowhere to save that little girl. Do you follow me? From nowhere. Section 18. The accident made the front page of the following day's Dairy News. Esther Perrine was sufficiently colorful in her remarks to warrant a sidebar of her own. The staff photographer Tom Matthews got a picture to go with it that made her look like Ma Jode in The Grapes of Wrath. The headline of the sidebar read, "It was like he came from nowhere," Eyewitness to Tragedy says. When she read it, Mrs. Perrine was not at all surprised. Section 19. In the end, I got what I wanted, Ralph said, but only because Clotho and Lachesis and whoever it is they work for on upper levels were desperate to stop Ed. Upper levels? What upper levels? What building? Never mind, you've forgotten, but remembering wouldn't change anything. Point is just this, Lois. They didn't want to stop Ed because thousands of people would have died if he'd hit the Civic Center dead on. They wanted to stop him because there was one person whose life needed to be preserved at any cost. In their reckoning, anyway. When I was finally able to make them see that I felt the same about my kid as they did about theirs, arrangements were made. That's when they cut you, wasn't it? And when you made the promise, the one you used to talk about in your sleep. He shot her a wide-eyed, startled, and heartbreakingly boyish glance. She only looked back. Yes, he said, and wiped his forehead. I guess so. Air lay in his lungs like metal shavings. A life for a life, that was the deal. Natalie's in exchange for my mind. Hey, quit trying to wiggle away. Quit it, Rover, or I'll kick your asshole square. Ralph broke off at the sound of that shrill, hectoring, horribly familiar voice. The voice no human being on Harris Avenue but him could hear, and looked across the street. Ralph? What? She pulled her back against the summer-dry hedge in front of the Applebaum's house. He wasn't doing anything so polite as perspiring now. His whole body was crawling with a stinking sweat as heavy as engine oil, and he could feel every gland in his body dumping a hot load into his blood. His underwear was trying to crawl up into the crack of his ass and disappear. His tongue tasted like a blown fuse. Lois followed the direction of his gaze. "Rosalie!" she cried. "Rosalie, you bad dog, what are you doing over there?" The black and tan beagle had given Ralph on their first Christmas was across the street, standing. Except cringing was actually the word for what she was doing. On the sidewalk in front of the house where Helen and Nat had lived until Ed had pooped his wig. For the first time in years, they'd had her. The beagle reminded Lois of Rosalie number 1. Rosalie number 2 appeared to be all alone over there, but that did not allay Lois's sudden terror. "Oh, what have I done?" she thought. "What have I done?" "Rosalie!" she screamed. "Rosalie, get over here!" The dog heard Lois, and Lois could see that she did, but she didn't move. "Ralph, what's happening over there?" he said again. And then just a little farther up the street, Lois saw something which stopped her breath. Her last unstated hope that all this was happening only in Ralph's head, that it was a kind of flashback to their previous experience, disappeared because now their dog had company. Holding a skip rope looped over her right arm, 6-year-old Nat Dipnew came to the end of her walk and looked down the street toward a house he didn't remember ever living in, toward a lawn where her shirtless father, an undesignated player named Ed Dipnew, had once sat among the intersecting rainbows, listening to the Jefferson Airplane as a single spot of blood dried on his John Lennon spectacles. Natty looked down the street and smiled happily at Rosalie, who was panting and watching her with miserable, frightened eyes. Section 20. Atropus doesn't see me, Ralph thought. He's concentrating on Rosalie, and on Natalie, of course, and he doesn't see me. Everything had come around with a sort of hideous perfection. The house was there, Rosalie was there, and Atropus was there too, wearing a hat cocked back on his head and looking like a wiseacre news reporter in the 1950s B picture. Something directed by Ida Lupino, perhaps. Only this time it wasn't a Panama with a bite gone from the brim. This time it was a Boston Red Sox cap, and it was too small even for Atropus because the adjustable band on the back had been pulled all the way over to the last hole. It had to be in order to fit the head of the little girl who owned it. All we need now is Pete, the paperboy, and the show would be perfect, Ralph thought. The final scene of Insomnia, or Short Time Life on Harrison Avenue. A tragic comedy in 3 acts. Everyone takes a bow and then exits stage right. This dog was afraid of Atropus, just as Rosalie #1 had been. And the main reason the little bald dog hadn't seen Ralph and Lois was that he was trying to keep her from running off before he was ready. And here came Nat, heading down the sidewalk toward her favorite dog in the whole world, Ralph and Lois's Rosie. Her jump rope, 369 on the good strength line, was slung over her arm. She looked impossibly beautiful and impossibly fragile in her sailor shirt and blue shorts. Her pigtails bounced. It's happening too fast, Ralph thought. Everything is happening much too fast. Not at all, Ralph. You did splendidly 5 years ago. You'll do splendidly now. It sounded like Clotho, but there was no time to look. The green car was coming slowly down Harris Avenue from the direction of the airport, moving with the sort of agonized care which usually meant the driver, who was very old or very young. Agonized care or not, it was unquestionably the car. A dirty membrane hung over it like a shroud. Life is a will, Ralph thought, and it occurred to him that this was not the first time the idea had occurred to him. Sooner or later, everything you thought you'd left behind comes around again. For good or ill, it comes around again. Rosie made another abortive lunge for freedom, and as Atropus yanked her back, losing his hat, Nat knelt before her and patted her. "Are you lost, girl? Would you get out by yourself? That's okay, I'll take you home." Excuse me. She gave Rosalie a hug, her small arms passing through Atropus's arms. Her small, beautiful face only inches from his ugly, grinning one. Then she got up. "Come on, Rosie. Come on, sugar pie." Rosie started down the sidewalk at Nat's heel, looking back once at the grinning little man and whining uneasily. On the other side of Harris Avenue, Roland came out of the Red Apple, and the last condition of the vision Atropus had shown Ralph was fulfilled. Helen had a loaf of bread in one hand. Her Red Sox hat was on her head. Ralph swept Lois into his arms and kissed her fiercely. "I love you with all my heart," he said. "Remember that, Lois." "I know you do," she said calmly. "And I love you. That's why I can't let you do it." She seized him around the neck, in her arms like bands of iron, and he felt her breast push against him hard as she drew in all the breath her lungs would hold. "Go away, you rotten bastard," she screamed. "I can't see you, but I know you're there. Go away, and leave us alone." Natalie stopped, dead in her tracks, and looked at Lois with wide-eyed surprise. Rosalie stopped beside her, ears pricking. "Don't go into the street, Nat," Lois screamed at her. "Don't!" Then her hands, which had been laced together at the back of Ralph's neck, were holding nothing. Her arms, which had been locked about his shoulders in a death grip, were empty. He was gone like smoke. Section 21. Atropus looked toward the cry of the alarm and saw Ralph and Lois standing on the other side of Harris Avenue. More important, he saw Ralph seeing him. His eyes widened. His lips parted in a hateful snarl. One hand flew to his bald pate. It was crisscrossed with old scars and remnants of wounds made with his own scalpel. An instinctive gesture of defense that was 5 years too late. "Fuck you, Shorts. This little bitch is mine." Ralph saw Nat looking at Lois with uncertainty and surprise. He heard Lois shrieking at her, telling her not to go into the street. Then it was Lachesis he heard, speaking from someplace close by. "Come up, Ralph, as far as you can, quickly." He felt the clench in the center of his head, felt the brief swoop of vertigo in his stomach, and suddenly the whole world brightened and filled with color. He half saw and half felt Lois's arms and locked hands collapse inward near the place where his body had been a moment before. And then he was drawing away from her. No, being carried away from her. He felt the pull of some great current and understood in a vague way that if there was such a thing as higher purpose, he had joined it and would soon be swept downriver with it. Natalie and Rosalie were now standing directly in front of the house which Ralph had once shared with Bill McGovern before selling up and moving into Lois's house. Nat glanced doubtfully at Lois and then waved tentatively. "She's okay, Lois. See, she's right here." She patted Rosalie's head. I'll cross her safe, don't worry. Then as she started into the street, she called to her mother. I can't find my baseball cap. I think somebody stole it. Rosalie was still on the sidewalk. Nat turned to her impatiently. Come on, girl. The green car was moving in the child's direction, but very slowly. It did not at first look like much of a danger to her. Ralph recognized the driver at once, and he did not doubt his senses or suspect he was having a hallucination. In that instant, it seemed very right that the approaching sedan should be piloted by his old paperboy. Natalie! Lois screamed. Natalie, no! Atropos darted forward and slapped Rosalie No. 2 on the rump. Get out of here, mutt. Go on, before I change my mind. Atropos spared Ralph one final grimacing leer as Rosie yelped and darted into the street, and into the path of the Ford driven by 16-year-old Pete Sullivan. Natalie didn't see the car. She was looking at Lois, whose face was all red and scary. It finally occurred to Nat that Lois wasn't screaming about Rosalie at all, but something else entirely. Pete registered the sprinting beagle. It was the little girl he didn't see. He swerved to avoid Rosalie, a maneuver that ended with the Ford aimed directly at Natalie. Ralph could see two frightened faces behind the windshield as the car veered, and he thought Mrs. Sullivan was screaming. Octopus was leaping up and down and doing an obscenely joyful hornpipe. Yeah, short time, silly white hair, told you I'd fix you. In slow motion, Helen dropped the loaf of bread she was holding. Natalie, look out! He shrieked. Ralph ran again, and there was that clear sensation of moving by thought alone. And as he closed in on Nat, while driving forward with his hands stretched out, aware of the car looming just beyond her, looking bright arrows of sun through its dark death bag and into his eyes. He clenched his mind again, bringing himself back down to the short-time world for the last time. He fell into a landscape that rang with splintered screams. Helen's mingled with Lois's mingled with the ones being made by the tires of the Ford. Weaving its way through them like an outlaw vine was the sound of Atropos's jeers. Ralph got a brief glimpse of Nat's wide blue eyes, and then he shoved her in the chest and stomach as hard as he could, sending her flying backward with her hands and feet thrust out in front of her. She landed sitting up in the gutter, bruising her tailbone on the curb, but breaking nothing. For some distant place, Ralph heard Atropos squawk in fury and disbelief. Then 2 tons of Ford, still traveling at 20 miles an hour, struck Ralph, and the soundtrack dropped dead. He was heaved upward and backward in a low, slow arc. It felt slow, anyway, from inside, and went with the Ford's hood ornament imprinted on his cheek like a tattoo, and one broken leg trailing behind him. There was time to see a shadow sliding along the pavement beneath him in the shape like an X. There was time to see a spray of red droplets in the air just above him, and to think that Lois must have splattered more paint on him than he had first thought. And there was time to see Natalie sitting at the side of the street, weeping but all right, and to sense Atropos on the sidewalk behind her, shaking his fists and dancing with rage. I believe I did pretty damn good for an old geezer, Ralph thought, but now I think I could really go for a nap. Then he came back to earth with a terrible mortal smack and rolled, skull fracturing, back breaking, lungs punctured by brittle thorns of bone as the rib cage exploded, liver turning to pulp, intestines first coming unanchored and then rupturing. And nothing hurt, nothing at all. Section 22. Lois never forgot the awful thud that was the sound of Ralph's return to Harris Avenue, or the bloody splash marks he left behind as he cartwheeled to a stop. She wanted to scream, but dared not. Some deep, true voice told her that if she did that, the combination of shock, horror, and summer heat would send her unconscious to the sidewalk. And when she came to again, Ralph would be beyond her. She ran instead of screaming, losing one shoe, marginally aware that Pete Sullivan was getting out of the Ford, which had come to rest almost exactly where Joe Weiser's car, also a Ford, had come to rest after Joe had hit Rosalie No. 1, all those years ago. She was also marginally aware that Pete was screaming. She reached Ralph and fell on her knees beside him, seeing that his shape had somehow been changed by the green Ford. But the body beneath the familiar chino pants and the paint-splattered shirt was fundamentally different from the body which had been pressed against hers less than a minute ago. But his eyes were open, and they were bright and aware. "Ralph?" "Yes." His voice was clear and strong, unmarked by either confusion or pain. "Yes, Lois, I hear you." She started to put her arms around him and hesitated, thinking about how you weren't supposed to move people who had been badly injured because you might hurt them even worse or kill them. Then she looked at him again, at the blood pouring from the sides of his mouth, and the way his lower body seemed to have come unhinged from the upper part, and decided it would be impossible to hurt Ralph more than he had been hurt already. She hugged him, leaning close, leaning into the smells of disaster, blood in the sweat, sour acetone odor of spent adrenaline on the outrush of his breath. "You did it this time, didn't you?" Lois asked. He kissed his cheek, his blood-soaked eyebrows, his bloody forehead, where the skin had been peeled away from his skull in a flap. He began to cry. "Look at you, shirt torn, pants torn. Do you think clothes grow on trees?" "Is he all right?" Helen asked from behind her. Lois didn't turn around, but she saw the shadows on the street. Helen with her arm around her weeping daughter's shoulders, and Rosie standing by Helen's right leg. "He saved Nat's life, and I didn't even see where he came from. Please, Lois, say he's all right." Then the shadows shifted as Helen moved to a place where she could actually see Ralph, and she pulled Nat's face against her blouse and began to wail. Lois leaned closer to Ralph, pressing his cheeks with the palms of her hands, wanting to tell him that she had meant to come with them. She had meant to, yes, but in the end, he had been too quick for her. In the end, he had left her behind. "Love you, sweetheart," Ralph said. He reached up and copied her gesture with his own palm. He tried to raise his left hand as well, but it would only lie on the pavement and twitch. Lois took his hand and kissed it. "Love you too, Ralph. Always, so much." "I had to do it, you see." Yes, she didn't know if she did see, didn't know if she would ever see, but she knew he was dying. "Yes, I see." He sighed harshly. That sweet acetone smell wafted up to her again and smiled. "Miss Chase? Miss Roberts, I mean?" It was Pete speaking in hitching gasp. "Is Mr. Roberts okay? Please say I didn't hurt him." "Stay away, Pete," she said without turning around. "Ralph is fine. He just tore his pants and shirt a little. Didn't you, Ralph?" "Yes," he said. "You bet. You'll just have to hoss-whip me for—" He broke off and looked at her left. No one was there, but Ralph smiled anyways. "The Chessies," he said. He put out his trembling, blood-grimy right hand, and as Lois, Helen, and Pete Sullivan watched, it rose and fell twice in the empty air. Ralph's eyes moved again, this time to the right. Slowly, very slowly. He moved his hand in that direction. When he spoke this time, his voice had begun to fade. "Hi, Clotho. Now remember, this doesn't hurt, right?" Ralph appeared to listen and then smiled. "Yep," he whispered. "Any way you can get her." His hand rose and fell again in the air, then dropped back to his chest. He looked up at Lois with his fading blue eyes. "Listen," he said, speaking with great effort, yet his eyes blazed, would not let hers go. "Every day I woke up next to you was like waking up young and seeing everything new." He tried to raise his hand to her cheek again, and could not. "Every day, Lois." "It was like that for me too, Ralph. Like waking up young." "Lois?" "What?" "The ticking," he said. He swallowed and said it again, enunciating the words with great effort. "The ticking." "What ticking?" "Never mind. It's stopped," he said. and smiled brilliantly. Then Ralph stopped too. Section 23. Clotho and Lucchesi stood watching Lois weep over the man who lay dead in the street. In one hand, Clotho held his scissors. He raised the other eye level and looked at it wonderingly. It glowed and blazed with Ralph's aura. Clotho, he's here, in here. How wonderful. Lucchesi raised his own right hand, but Clotho's left. It looked as if someone had pulled a blue mitten over the normal green-gold aura which swaddled it. Yes, he was a wonderful man. Shall we give him to her? Can we? There's one way to find out. They approached Lois. Each placed the hand Ralph had shaken in one side of Lois's face. Section 24. Mommy, Natalie Depney cried. In her agitation, she had reverted to the patios of her babyhood. Who those widow men? Why they touchin' Rollus? Honey, Helen said, and buried Nat's head against her breast again. There were no men, little or otherwise, near Lois Roberts. She was kneeling alone in the street next to the man who had saved her daughter's life. Section 25. Lois looked up suddenly, her eyes wide and surprised, her grief forgotten as a gorgeous feeling of light blue light. Calmness and peace filled her. For a moment, Harris Avenue was gone. She was in a dark place filled with the sweet smells of hay and cows, a dark place that was split by 100 brilliant seams of light. He never forgot the fierce joy that leaped up in her at that moment, nor the sure sense that she was seeing a representation of a universe that Ralph wanted her to see, a universe where there was dazzling light behind the darkness. Couldn't she see it through the cracks? Can you ever forgive me? Pete was sobbing. Oh my God, can you ever forgive me? Oh yes, I think so, Lois said calmly. She passed her hand down Ralph's face, closing his eyes, and then held his head in her lap and waited for the police to come. To Lois, Ralph looked as if he had gone to sleep. When she saw the long white scar on his right forearm was gone. September 10th, 1990 through November 10, 1993. Well, that's it. We made it through the book. I'm gonna have to find another one, so like I said, you guys, leave me an idea of what book you'd like me to pick up next, and I will do my best to get it. Alright, so on that note, boys and girls, we're going to go to our first music break. On this break, we have the lovely and talented Miss Mia Savage with Your Skeleton, Our New Reality, Let Me Be Your Home, and Lemurian Crypto. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break. Welcome back, and thanks so much for hanging out with me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. We finished Insomnia by Stephen King. And I was going to look up some stuff to read online. I actually found, I believe it's the last book from the collection that I got from my grandpa. And YouTube and whoever else might want to get rid of this episode because of what the book's about. This is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So the book is called The Nazis and the Occult: The Dark Forces Unleashed by the Third Reich. On the back it says, why did the country which produced Goethe, Beethoven, Bach, Schiller, Einstein, Kant, and Hegel allow itself to be led to the precipice of self-destruction by a ragged collective of criminals, misfits, sadists, and petty bureaucrats? Featuring many rare archive photographs, The Nazis and the Occult reveals the true nature of the Third Reich's link with the arcane influences and of evil itself, as well as explaining how an ill-educated, psychologically unbalanced non-entity succeeded in mesmerizing an entire nation. Forget what you have read, seen, and heard. This is the real secret history of Nazi Germany and its dark messiah, Adolf Hitler. On the bottom it says, no one can deny Paul Roland is a complete master of this subject. That was by Colin Wilson, author of The Occult and the Criminal History of Mankind. So we'll start with the introduction. When my father surveyed the destruction of Nazi Germany in 1946 as part of the Allied Army of Occupation, he shared the belief held by the victors that they had defeated a formidable military machine and liberated a population who had been living under totalitarian dictatorship since Adolf Hitler's accession to power in 1933. During the war, Churchill, Roosevelt, and even Stalin, but later transpired, had murdered even more of his own people than had Hitler, joined the religious leaders in describing the Second World War in apocalyptic terms as being a battle between the forces of light and darkness, a struggle between good and evil for the soul of the civilized world. But this was considered merely religious and political rhetoric. At that time, conventional historians attributed the rise of Nazism exclusively to socio-economic factors, and that remained to the accepted view for the next 20 years. Hitler had appeared at a time of national crisis to haul a demoralized Germany off its knees. Following the inglorious defeat of the First World War and restore its national pride, he brought it through a decade of political instability and ruinous inflation by ruthlessly eliminating the opposition and borrowing far beyond his country's means. Hitler has been called a shrewd political strategist, but in truth he simply did as he wished and damned the consequences. In crude terms, he was spoiled for a fight. His inner demons demanded constant stress, adoration, and attention like a spoilt child. Once in power, he refused to pay the punitive reparations imposed on Germany by the victors and rebuilt his armed forces in defiance of Versailles Treaty, which was intended to limit German rearmament. Then he marched into the occupied Rhineland, annexed Austria, and snatched back the Sudetenland, half hoping for a reaction from the outraged international community. Again, the action of a petulant bully. But this only earned him the admiration of his people and begrudging respect of other world leaders, who would like to have been equally self-assertive. It was not only the fascist leaderships in Spain and Italy who openly admired Germany's ability to get its own house in order, but many European aristocrats who shared Hitler's suspicion of the Jews, whom they regarded as having far too much control of the financial infrastructure. And despite their initial dislike of the petty, bourgeois Austrian corporal German industrialists also came to embrace the new order, grateful for revitalization of the German economy, particularly the armaments industry on which many had built their fortunes and family names. By the time Germany hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936, the nation was regarded as a model of reconstruction and regeneration, and was looked upon with envy by Britain and America, as well as by its longtime enemy France, all of whom expressed their regard for the German qualities of resourcefulness, industry, and organization. As for Nazis' persecution and disenfranchising of the Jews, made legal by the iniquitous Nuremberg laws, this was excused as being the excessive zeal of a regimen which would come into line with its neighbors in due course. The worst their critics would say was that the Nazis were political opportunists and street brawlers whose strutting leaders affected cultural pretensions, which they never possessed, inviting comparison with America's gangsters. No one seriously believed that there was anything more sinister at work behind the scenes than rabid nationalism. Not only the full extent of Nazi atrocities were revealed to the world at the Nuremberg trials. Disbelief at the scale of the wholesale murder of millions and the clinical efficiency with which it had been perpetuated led even the most dispassionate observers to describe the Nazis as evil and Hitler's power over his people as messianic. But no one seemed able to answer the questions which the revelations of Nuremberg had raised, namely, how could a cultured nation which had produced Goethe, Beethoven, Bach, Schiller, Einstein, Kant, Hegel, and so many of the world's greatest thinkers and artists allow itself to be led, lemming-like, to the precipice of self-destruction by a ragged collective of criminals, misfits, sadists, and petty bureaucrats, the very dregs of its society? And why did that society so readily fall for the blatant propaganda perpetrated by men who shamelessly appealed to their basest instincts? Moreover, how could one explain the enigma of the demagogue itself? As the respected British historian A.G.P. Taylor remarked, how could a man so ignorant, so enslaved by stupid dogmas, have achieved such practical success? It seemed inconceivable that a man of Hitler's limited imagination, intellect, and avowed indolence could have galvanized a nation into following him blindly where he willed, unless there was something else empowering him, which the people sensed and entrusted with their fate. In short, what was the true name of the regime that had raised Germany from the defeat to be a master of Europe, and thence the wholesale destruction in less than 12 years? It was not until the occult revival of the late 1960s that interest in the Third Reich and its possible link with black magic gave birth to a slew of sensationalist alternative histories and fictional accounts of Nazi associations with dark forces. Popular culture of the period reflected the public's morbid fascination with the more sensational aspects of the supernatural, spawning such films as Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, The Omen, and The Boys from Brazil, in which mad Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele successfully cloned young boys from cells taken from Hitler's body. But the horrors were not all confined to fiction. The Age of Aquarius dawned to reveal the sadism inflicted by Nazi-loving Charles Manson and his devil-worshipping groupies, together with the ravages wrought on an entire generation by drug addiction and horrors televised daily from Vietnam. Overnight, the hippies' psychedelic dream darkened and disillusionment set in. Many began to question the nature of evil and wonder if the devil and his disciples really did exist. And if evil was a conscious entity actively seeking entry into our world, could that account for the nightmare of Nazism from which the world was just beginning to awaken? In the past 40 years, a number of writers have claimed to have uncovered truth concerning Hitler's pact with some diabolical agency, but in the main, they have merely exploited our persistent morbid fascination with the Third Reich and perpetuated the myth of Nazi involvement with the occult. It is the purpose of this book to demystify these dark fairy tales and reveal the true nature of Nazi Germany's link with arcane influences and of evil itself. Nice touchdown. I have drawn extensively on secret Nazi documents and the private diaries and correspondence of Hitler's satanic mentors, as well as those of the members of his inner circle to reveal whether Nazi ideology was indeed rooted in occultism. The intention of this book is to explain how an ill-educated, psychologically unbalanced non-entity succeeded in mesmerizing an entire nation, why the German people generated their Führer as a god, and how he exercised his power over them to the extent that they were willing to follow him to the abyss of self-destruction. Forget what you have read, seen, and heard. This is the real secret history of the Third Reich and its dark messiah, Adolf Hitler. Chapter 1. Dark Gurus. The motivating power, then, in all magical operations is the trained will of the magician. All the adjuncts of ceremonial magic, lights, colors, circles, triangles, perfumes, are merely aids concentrating the will of the magician into a blazing stream of pure energy. And that was a quote by Francis King, Ritual Magic in England. Ritual magic is the act of communicating with the subconscious to empower the practitioners with the attributes required, or to influence Providence to provide them with what is desired. By definition, then, black magic is the art of influencing another person to do your bidding by imposing your greater willpower on their subconscious and, ultimately, to create the world in your image. By this definition, Hitler and the leading Nazis were intuitive black magicians. The art of magic in itself is neither good nor evil. It is the intention behind the desire that determines whether one is working with the universal laws or manipulating them for one's own ends. The circles, symbols, and stagecraft have no inherent power of their own. It is the impression these rituals produce on the psyche which affects results. But magic is not a quick fix that promises something for nothing. As with any other demanding spiritual discipline, every magical operation was subject to the law of karma, the law of cause and effect, which states that whatever you put in will come back to you. Magic is natural to mankind, not supernatural. In its most subtle form, it is evident in the art of seduction, when one attempts to impress a prospective partner through eye contact, subtle facial expressions, body language, and an alluring intonation in the voice. Physical attraction on its own is rarely sufficient. Same ritual can be witnessed in its most primal and potent form in the animal kingdom, when certain predators literally fascinate their prey by their hypnotic movements until they are ready to strike. Magic is not a relic of the Dark Ages. It has been and continues to be practiced every day by ordinary men and women in civilized societies, as well as in so-called primitive communities. However, unless the individual is an adept who has consciously performed a ritual to create a specific effect, the results are invariably attributed to luck, fate, personal charisma, or coincidence. Magic in its truest sense is at the core of every creative act. Every desire that we bring into physical manifestation, from conceiving children to planning our home. It is also part of the process by which we draw upon our latent strengths whenever we psych ourselves up to perform extraordinary feats or pluck up the courage to face something we fear. However, for most of us, wishes and daydreams dissolve into the ether when we return to reality because we have not learned how to focus our mental energy and sustain the image we wish to bring into the being. In contrast, magicians empower their desires with sufficient vital energy by focusing their mental and emotional resources on the specific object. This then takes on a reality in the higher worlds and eventually manifests in our material world in the form of envisage. Ritual magicians employ various theatrical effects to assist them to get into character, perform what is effectively the central role in modern mystery play, a sacred act in which they identify with a god who personifies a specific attribute that they wish to awaken within themselves. If they wish to strengthen their intuitive powers, for example, they will assemble artifacts corresponding to the moon, the planetary body associated with that aspect of their personality. They will decorate their room with drapes of color corresponding to the chosen planet, and place associated objects on the altar, again to attune them to the quality which that planet represents. Even the incense will be chosen to focus magician's mind on the single principle. The conjurations will then be carried out in a consecrated circle, sealed with sacred signs and symbols which define the magician's sphere of influence. In such an atmosphere, the magician's consciousness will be raised from the mundane to a higher state of awareness, a greater reality where the real inner work of transformation can be done. Ambitious and successful individuals invariably achieve what they aspire to because they practice this form of inner temple magic, now known as Jungian psychologists and New Age gurus as creative visualization. Hitler possessed a vision of himself as a leader of Germany, and he ensured that he was in the right place at the right time to seize the opportunity that he had created. His sense of destiny and of being protected by Providence was nothing more than his intuitive sense of his own ability to manipulate people and events or within his sphere of influence. The most obvious demonstration of this ability was the staging of the Führer's public appearances at the Nuremberg rallies. When he withdrew from public life during the war, his power diminished and his acolytes were reduced to squabbling among themselves. But the Nazis have not been the only organization to exploit the power of ritual mass manipulation. With their effective use of magic, lights, and sexual imagery, rock concerts can be as potent as any pagan rite. Religious organizations also acknowledge the value of ritualized worship. To use candles, incense, and symbols and the hypnotic quality of prayer to create a sense of unity, climaxed with sharing of some form of sacrament, which is as theatrical and potentially transforming as any magical ceremony. Every political parties and commercial corporations practice a crude form of magic when they use a memorable symbol or slogan to impact or enforce their desire for whatever it is that they are selling, be it commercial merchandise or an ideology. Nevertheless, in modern times, few movements have used ritual magic and its attendant paraphernalia as effectively as the Nazis. What made them even more dangerous was the fact that they were unaware that they were doing so, and consequently they were unable to control the forces that they had invoked. Such forces have been traditionally envisaged as demons and devils, but they are merely the manifestation of our unconscious fears and desires. It is not necessary to believe in the existence of evil as a conscious entity to unleash it. The intention to dominate and manipulate, sufficient for evil, is entirely man-made. The Nazi hierarchy were intuitive magicians who exercised their will over the German nation by their unconscious exploitation of powerful arcane symbols, evocative music, quasi-religious ritual, and, most significant of all, cultural archetypes. Archetypes. Archetypes are universal figures which personify abstract qualities, characteristics, or ideals, such as the hero, the villain, the mother, the father, the magician, the witch, or seductress. They are common to all cultures around the world and feature in myths and folk tales, where they represent specific personality types that are likely to be encountered in real life. They occasionally appear in our dreams because they can embody a specific aspect of our own personality, or that of other people we have encountered, and because they are A universally recognized symbol, they have a strong resonance in our subconscious. By invoking certain archetypes, the Nazis appealed directly to the nation's deepest fears and aspirations. For example, they didn't need to appeal to the intellect to rationalize their persecution of the Jews. All they needed was to depict the Jew as a hideous figure, intent on deflowering Aryan maidenhood, to trigger the desired response in Aryan men. Similarly, the Nazi propagandists only had to invoke the image of Siegfried, who was the personification of Teutonic manhood, to awaken the latent hunger for comradeship, adventure, and combat in every young German male whenever they needed more volunteers for the SS or the Wehrmacht. Hitler was not an attractive man, but he evidently held a particular fascination for women, which was not solely due to the power he wielded, nor to his personal magnetism, which would only affect those in his immediate presence. For those in his thrall, he personified the father figure, symbol of authority and protection. While for others, of a more mystical mindset, he fulfilled their hope for the Messiah, a savior. For Germany's enemies, he was the personification of evil, the archetypal trickster, or Antichrist for those of a biblical bent. Clearly, he could not have been all of these. More likely, he was none of them. He was a blank canvas onto which both admirers and his enemies could project the archetype of their own choosing, and that is what made him such a potent symbol. Carl Jung, the father of modern psychoanalysis, believed that Hitler had the ability to address the Teutonic archetypes to symbolize the primal forces in the German psyche. Wotan, aka Odin, Thor, and the Lords of Chaos. Jung suggested that these gods were revitalized by contact with Hitler and erupted from the collective unconscious to lead the nation to war. The dawn of the magicians. Natural magic or physical magic is nothing other than the deepest knowledge of the secrets of nature. Del Rio, 16th century. The true meanings of the words magic and occult are misunderstood by those outside the esoteric tradition. In the popular imagination, they evoke lurid images of men in voluminous robes adorned with exotic symbols conjuring demons from the abyss, or cackling old hags cavorting naked under the full moon. Such scenarios were, however, the invention of the medieval mind, and specifically of the early church, which created the devil and his disciples to frighten followers of the old religion into abandoning their beliefs and instead put their faith in a messianic savior who promised to redeem them from original sin. Despite the recent rekindling of interest in paganism and paranormal, such superstitions and a general wariness of the occult still persist today. It is no wonder, then, that few can accept the idea that Hitler and his Nazi regime might have been practitioners of the black arts. They cannot imagine the brown-shirted bullies of the SA, Wehrmacht, and the black uniformed legions of the SS, Schutzstaffel, forming a satanic coven, or Hitler and Himmler standing in a magic circle uttering the barbarous words of invocation. For Hitler to guarantee world domination. But if the original meaning of the word occult is understood to mean simply that which is hidden or unknown, and a truer definition of magic is that which involves the exercising of will to bring about the change that would not occur naturally, then a compelling case can be made from Hitler having practiced black magic and the Nazi era being manifestation of demonic power. Such a sense does not, of course, just appear like Mephistopheles at the Depth's invitation. The stage must be set, the time of the ritual chosen to coincide with favorable alignments of the stars, and the necromancer needs to prepare himself or risk being overwhelmed by demonic forces he seeks to invoke. Such preparations were in place in Germany at the turn of the 20th century. Warrior breed? As an idealistic young man, Guido von List, 1848 to 1919, believed himself to be the last and long, illustrious line of Nordic warrior magicians, known as the Arminen, after the chieftain Arminius, whose blonde, blue-eyed ancestors had driven the Roman legions out of Germany. At the age of 14, he had knelt before a ruined altar in the crypt of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, renounced his Catholic faith, and committed himself to building a temple to Wotan. By the time of his death, he had honored the promise of his youth in words, though not in stone, by erecting an altar of ideas at which the nationalists could worship the gods of past glories, both real and imagined. Guido Karl Anton List was a tradesman's son who awarded himself the aristocratic appellation von, a habit shared by many of his occult brethren with upper-class pretensions. It is customary to portray him as a visionary, a mystically minded, bearded patriarch of Ariosophist movement, a group of Vienna-based Völkisch nationalists who sought to reunify a divided nation by stressing its cultural identity at a time of political disunity. Volkisch means of the people and refers to a movement combining folklore, occultism, and ethnic nationalism, later espoused by the Nazis. But such ideas betray the yearnings of dreamers, not scholars. In truth, the Ariosophists were a clique of arithmetic enlists, elitists whose dreams of an individualized past exemplified by chivalry and the nobility of rural life were tainted by virulent racism. A strong case could be made to support the allegation that the Nazis' anti-Christian sentiment originated with von List, who accused the early church of having first humiliated and persecuted the Arminianschaft, driven them out of Germany, and demonizing their deities as satanic. Moreover, Ariosophists' entire ideological edifice was built on unstable ground. Von List's armament, for example, was a wholly fictitious occult system, a wish-fulfillment fantasy founded on the misinterpretation of the central maxim of the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, which states, as above, so below. Von List interpreted the maxim to mean that God created a hierarchy of superior and inferior beings, which gave him the theological basis for justifying the conceit of Aryan Teutonic superiority, whereas the tenet of understood by true initiates to denote that the divine attributes are manifest in infinite form in all mankind, regardless of race, creed, or color. Von List also undermined his Weltanschauung worldview by declaring that the mythical Armenian Brotherhood had left philological clues to the location of their sacred sites in the place, names of hills, rivers, and towns, despite a lack of evidence to support this contention. He simply read into place names whatever he wanted to find and ignored sites which did not conform to his theory. Moreover, many of his assertions were made on the basis of his vision, not fact, while walking up the Harmenskogel, north of Vienna, and again while camped out at the Geiselberg hill fort. He claimed to have had a vision of his ancestors performing rites, and it was these clairvoyant glimpses into the past on which he based his thesis. Had he poured his considerable energy and imagination into writing fiction, he might have enjoyed a reputation equal to that of the Gothic novelist Edward Bulwen-Lytton, who fed the fantasies of the proto-Nazis in novels such as The Coming Race. Instead, he was born in the age of be irrational when anyone who claimed to have channeled the arcane wisdom of the ancients, or read the secrets of life and death in the Akashic records, an invisible matrix of mental energy, would find a receptive audience. Hey, Mart. The first years of the 20th century had seen an explosion of interest in psychic phenomena and Eastern philosophy as a reaction to the prevailing materialism and modernity. This interest found expression in the fashionable new religions of spiritualism and theosophy. Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophist movement, had probably boasted that she had taken dictation while in a mediumistic trance from her hidden masters who existed on a higher spiritual plane. The result was the voluminous Secret Doctrine, 1888, which introduced the concept of a superior prehistoric Atlantean race to the world. So when von List published the first of his Aryan ideological tracts, German Mythological Landscapes, 1891, such ideas were not only in vogue, but its author could rest assured that he would not be pressed to provide evidence for his pronouncements. In such circles, psychic insight has seen to be as valid as empirical research, if not more so. Insights received in trance were considered as unassailable as the visions of the prophets. His admirers clearly thought of him in those terms and gathered together to form Guido von List Society in 1908 with aim of promoting his works around the world. The second annual conference of the Theosophical Society, held in London in 1907, a German admirer, von Ulrich, introduced von List's theories to a receptive worldwide audience, love of the fatherland. Said von Ulrich was among the virtues of the German peoples, and he who loves his fatherland loves his past, which is, indeed, only the mother of the present. Von List's success was assured. However, it seems von List's prophetic powers cannot be as readily dismissed as his visions of the past. Towards the end of the Great War, he predicted that those who had given their lives for the fatherland would be reborn to lead a nationalist revolution and wreak revenge on the Allies. They would be led by a Stark von Oben, strong one from above. The year would be 1932. On that point, at least, von List was not far from the truth. The Germanian Order. Von List's mystical neo-paganism was evidently not pragmatic enough for his disciple, Philip Staff. He was one of the principal members of the Germanian Order, which was founded in 1912, and whose stated aims were the monitoring of the Jews and their activities, and the distribution of anti-Semitic material, specifically the group's own rabidly racist magazine Hammer, which they boasted was their sharpest weapon against Jewry and other enemies of the people. Curiously, this anti-Semitic order modeled itself on the Freemasons, a philanthropic fraternity who were accused of being an agency of the mythical worldwide Jewish conspiracy. Despite being prey to internal squabbling, as various egos fought for control of the group, the order played a significant role in creating the climate which nurtured the Nazi Party. Even so, the crank element was also in evidence in the form of a racial physical examination, which was performed in Berlin by phonologist Robert Bergen-Villingen and his patent plastometer machine. So applicants were required to submit to an exhaustive series of cranial measurements to determine their racial purity, after which the successful candidates were permitted to take part in an initiation ceremony which mixed elements of the Golden Dawn, an occult group founded in 1888, Freemasonry, and scenes from Wagner's mythical music dramas. The novices were led blindfolded into the candlelit ceremonial chamber, where the master of the lodge, flanked by two members dressed in knights' robes, awaited them. The knights wore horned helmets and leaned on their swords, barring the entrance to the uninitiated. In front of them, the lodge treasurer and secretary sat at a table wearing white Masonic sashes, while in the center of the room stood the herald. At the rear of the room, in the area which represented the Grove of the Grail, stood the bard and the master of ceremonies, the former robed in white, the latter in blue. Around the latter stood the brothers, forming a semicircle as far as the treasurer's table. At the far end of the room, in an antechamber, a choir of forest elves sang to the accompaniment of a wheezing harmonium. As the novices waited without, the brothers broke into the Pilgrim's Chorus from Tannhauser and greeted the master of ceremonies by making the sign of the swastika, which he solemnly returned. This signaled the ushering in of the novices, who heard a speech by the master of ceremonies introducing the aims of the order and laying out its Aryo-Germanic ideology. Bard then lit the sacred flame, and the novices took off their blindfolds and robes to stand naked before their brethren. The ceremony climaxed with the master presenting the spear of Wotan to the prospective candidates who answered his invocations, while music from Lohengrin rose accompanied by the elfin choir. It is no wonder that Hitler later condemned such theatrics as the impotent posturing of pseudo-mystics in a speech at the 1938 Reich Party Congress. At the pinnacle of our program stands not mysterious premonition, but clear knowledge and hence open avowal. But woe if the movement or the state, through the insinuation of obscure mystical elements, should give unclear orders, and it is enough if this lack of clarity is contained merely in words. There is already a danger if orders are given for the setting up of so-called cult places, because this alone will give birth to the necessity subsequently to devise so-called cult games and cult rituals. Our cult is exclusively cultivation of that which is natural and hence willed by God. So from the German order emerged yet another phony aristocrat, Baron Rudolf von Sebottendorf, real name Adam Alfred Rudolf Blauer, who was to have an insidious influence on Nazi ideology. Sebottendorf, who drowned himself in the Bosporus in 1945 because he couldn't bear to see Germany in ruins, was unapologetic about his racist views, which he made plain in his choice of name for his own faction, the premier anti-Semitic lodge. Candidates had to prove that the purity of their blood went back 3 generations and submit to having their skull measurements taken to confirm their racial suitability. Such ideas were not, as one might expect, on the fringe of German politics, but at its core. It is a popular misconception that the Nazis instigated German anti-Semitism. The growth of the Volkskultur cult subculture demonstrates the existence of deep-rooted racism in Germany preceding the Nazi era. Hitler merely exploited it. By the outbreak of the Great War, there were some 100 Germanian order lodges across Germany. When their younger members volunteered or were conscripted in 1914, they brought their racist ideology with them into the trenches. In the man-made hell of no man's land, these demonic evangelists found fertile soil in which to sow the bitter seeds of fascism. Origin of the swastika. So one of the first periodicals to promote what could be called occult nationalism was funded by Sebottendorf. Runes featured articles on occult science, earth mysteries, rune lore, and racial somatology, a branch of anthropology concerned with physical characteristics. This was just one of a wave of occult literature published in the years before the Great War to satisfy the growing public appetite for esoteric knowledge and alternative philosophies. These included Der Wanderer, Fana, Theosophy, and Bluten, as well as the flute of astrological periodicals and an influential series of books under the Osiris imprint. To promote his beliefs in his magazine, Sebottendorf sponsored a separate study group to explore the basis belief in the lost continent of Thule, the Nordic Atlantis, which he asserted was the origin of the Teutonic race. The Thule group included future Nazi philosopher Alfred Rosenberg and Hitler's mentor Dietrich Eckart. This prompted Sabotendorf to boast Thule members were the people to whom Hitler first turned and who first allied themselves with Hitler, although there is no evidence that Hitler attended any of their meetings. The significance of the Thule rests almost entirely on their adoption of three symbols, which were later to appear on Nazi regalia: the sword, an oak leaf cluster, and the hooked cross, more commonly known as the swastika. The origins of the swastika are unknown. All that can be said for certain is that it was used many thousands of years ago as a symbol of good fortune. Its Sanskrit name, swasti, translates as all is well. In countries as far apart as Peru, China, India, Tibet, and Scandinavia, it is thought that von List may have been the first to appropriate it as a symbol of German nationalism, having seen it featured in the stained glass windows of a Viennese church. He suggested that the swastika was a sacred Aryan symbol derived from the Feuerquerl, which is the fire whisk, and with which the universe had been created. But whatever its origin, it would have been familiar to occultists throughout Europe as the symbol of the Theosophical Society. To the historians of the heraldic detail, during the Nazi era, a genealogical society gleefully unearthed the forgotten fact the Prussian royal family had featured a swastika on its coat of arms. In 1898, Edward Hume, author of Symbolism in Christian Art, had pointed out the use of affloat, swastika's heraldic name. Early Christians merely adopted and diverted their own purpose, a symbol centuries older than the Christian era, a symbol of early Aryan origin, found abundantly in Indian and Chinese art. It stands for the lightning wielded by the omnipotent deity, whether the deity be Manu, Buddha, or Brahma of the East, or the Thor or Zeus of the West. An association with evil was known long before the Nazi era, but even as Theosophists did not decide which way round denoted malevolence and which the contrary. In a 1909 issue, Theosophical Review, H.S. Green attempted to clarify the issue. Most readers will be aware that some difference of opinion exists as to the direction in which the cross is supposed to be turning. Whichever may be considered to be the correct way of drawing the symbol, the opposite one will stand for that which is contrary to the divine order, and so for evil in general and black magic in particular. We noted that if the arms of the swastika were depicted as if turning anti-clockwise, then it would denote the divine order, which was the direction shown on the official seal of the Theosophical Society. Even so, this was the direction chosen by the Nazis. The opposite direction was said to symbolize this descending hammer of Thor, the Norse god of thunder, and therefore the destructive force. Clearly, the Nazis were either unaware of the significance denoted by its direction, or they thought of themselves as crusaders against the evil, degenerate, subhuman, non-Aryan races, and deliberately chose to depict the hangin cross, bring in an anti-clockwise direction. Most likely, they simply didn't care. It was an instantly recognizable symbol, simple, stark, and strong. The swastika is thought to have first caught Hitler's eye as a boy when he attended school at Lombok, Austria, in 1897. Each day he had to pass through the archway of the Benedictine monastery, which bore the order's coat of arms featuring a swastika. 23 years later, when he was searching for a symbol for the party flag, he seized on the swastika, which was central to a design drawn by dentist Friedrich Krom, a member of the Germanian order and its offshoot, the Thule Society. It featured a black swastika on a white circle within a red field. the white symbolizing national unity and the red representing the bloodshed for the cause, although the official line was that the red represented the party's socialist aspirations. Kron's swastika spun clockwise, which Hitler insisted be reversed. Curiously, it is in the Jewish esoteric teachings known as Kabbalah, which forms the foundation of the Western magical tradition. But the counterclockwise direction of the swastika, as used by Hitler, is understood to denote evil. Perhaps Madame Blavatsky thought that the subject did not merit further consideration. Perhaps she had higher matters on her mind. Insidious influences. It would hardly be going too far to say that the horrors of Belsen in the ovens of Auschwitz were ultimately derived from the occult racial ravings of von Liebenfels and the tiny group of his followers who existed, like maggots in an apple, within the tolerant and civilized environment of Franz Joseph's empire. And that was Francis King, Satan and Swastika, I guess is the name of the book. Von List's more fervent disciple, Franz von Liebenfels, was another counterfeit aristocrat. His name was Adolf Joseph Lanz, the son of a Viennese schoolmaster who yearned from an early age to establish a new Aryo-Christian religion, over which he would preside as the supreme, unquestionable authority. He was obsessed with the pomp and pageantry of religious rituals and burned with fanatical piety, which was matched by an equally obsessive interest in sex. In 1893, at the age of 19, he had taken holy orders at the Cistercian monastery Heiligenkreuz, but was defrocked for unspecified transgressions 6 years later. In a fit of pique, he formed his own religious order, the Order of the New Templars, which was built on the belief that God and evil were at war in the world, the former being embodied in the Aryan, and the latter in their racial inferiors, the Apelings. The Aryans, said Liebenfels, worshipped the god Fraja Christus, a Gothic name for Jesus, who demanded the sacrificial slaughter of the subhumans to purify the world. Once again, the parallels with the Nazis are striking. It was Liebenfels who coined the term Ariosophy in 1915 to encompass the philosophical outlook shared by the various Volkisch occult groups who were active at the time, and who cited the main purpose of the movement as being the study of the differences between the blonde and the dark races, the former being the embodiment of the panpsychic energy which animated all life on Earth. In Liebenfels' scheme, the Aryans were God incarnate, whose esoteric teachings and mastery of the occult sciences had been long lost through their descendants' preoccupation with technology, and the pleasurable diversions of this world, specifically carnal knowledge of inferior races. In so doing, they had forfeited their rightful place in the natural hierarchy. If Aryan man was to have a chance to reclaiming his birthright, Liebenfels declared he must look for clues to justify his claim to power in the heraldic devices and names of his ancestors, and also in the psychic record of history impressed on the ether, the Akashic records, which could be assessed through such esoteric arts as palmistry and astrology. Like von List, von Liebenfels was possessed of a restless energy and intellectual curiosity, but unfortunately it was directed toward an unproductive and perverse end. Accordingly, he attempted to find a scientific basis for his religious beliefs by forcing the facts to fit his theory, discarding any evidence that proved inconvenient with a shrug, as if to say, scientists will never fully understand the incomprehensible mysteries of God and his universe. Hitlers and his irrational philosophers, Horbiger, Willigut, and Wirth, to name but three, were to use the same argument to justify their wild fantasies, which also flew in the face of the facts. While they waxed ecstatic over the possibility of unearthing archaeological evidence to support their belief in a race of prehistoric Nordic supermen, Liebenfels was getting hot under the collar at the thought of rampant sexual ceremonial rites in the forests of the fatherland. He interpreted the story of the fall of man in the Bible as a warning against bestiality, which he surmised had been the chief occupation of the chosen people, the Aryans, and the reason for their downfall. Under this delusion, he decoded the Passion as the attempted rape of Christ by the pet pygmies of a satanic cult of beastmen who were devoted to interbreeding. This specious mix of theology and anthropology synthesized in a new and dangerous quasi-science that became known as theozoology. Also the prophet of this new order, it naturally fell to leaving Fels to write its Bible. He called it theozoology, or the lore of the Sodom apelings and the electron of the gods. A monomaniacal rant betraying the author's repressed sexuality and a hatred for women which almost rivaled that of his hatred for the Jews. Jeez. Bestial lust. Well, I think we'll leave it at that. We go to our second music break. On this break we have the lovely and talented Miss Mia Savage with her band Antidote for Savages, and she will be singing The Bottom Line, Bury Me in Heaven, Not a Phase, and Singing to Your Grave. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break.
choice. No record, no work, no job, no savings or money.
Just a choice right now between fear and love. Choice right now between fear and love.
Welcome back, and thanks so much for joining me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Tonight we're doing story time with me, TessaTNT. We finished our Stephen King book, Insomnia, and we have started another book called The Nazis and the Occult, The Dark Forces Unleashed by the Third Reich. And as I said, YouTube and whoever else might want to block this video, it's for educational purposes only. Alrighty then. Bestial lust. He damned women as weak for submitting so willingly to bestial lust, presumably only when it involved sex with a racial inferior, and urged that they should be conscripted as brood mothers in eugenic convents, where they would be serviced by Aryan males to ensure the purity of the race. In an effort to restrict the breeding of the inferior races, the state could order them to be forcibly sterilized, enslaved, or even incinerated. It's no wonder that the abbot of Highland Cruz refused his final wish to be buried within the monastery grounds. When Liebenfels raised the swastika flag over the battlements of Orphenstein Castle in 1907 to inaugurate his new order of Templar Knights, his admirers believed that they were witnessing the dawn of a new epoch in German history, which would usher in a cultural and spiritual renaissance. Had they known what he would later write to a member of their order in 1932, they might not have been so eager to see the era come into being. Hitler is one of our pupils. You will one day experience that he, and through him we, will one day be victorious and develop a movement that will take the world and make the world tremble. In fact, there's no evidence that Hitler was ever a member of the order, though it is possible that he and Liebenfels exchanged a few words one day in 1909 when Hitler reputedly called at the offices of Ostara, a magazine edited by Liebenfels, to purchase a number of back issues, but the source of this story was von Liebenfels himself. Man and Superman, Wagner and Nietzsche. Whoever wants to understand National Socialist Germany must first know Wagner, Adolf Hitler. No history of the Third Reich occult or otherwise would be complete without at least a brief mention of two men who were profound influence on Hitler and Nazi ideology: composer Richard Wagner and philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. The former inspired Hitler with the idea of his war against the communists and Jews was a mystical crusade, while the latter provided him with the belief that there was an intellectual argument to justify his global ambitions, and a logical basis for his fanatical beliefs. The German soul has passages and galleries in it. There are caves, hiding places, and dungeons therein. Its disorder has much of the charm of the mysterious. The German is well acquainted with the bypaths to chaos. Friedrich Nietzsche. On the day Hitler was born, Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, had made a prophetic comment in his notebook. I know my destiny. Someday my name will be associated with the memory of something monstrous. He sensed that the complex philosophy outlined in Man and Superman, Beyond Good and Evil, and the Antichrist would be distorted and corrupted by those who would seize on the superficial implications of what he had put forward rather than on the substance of his argument. In the last named, he described Christianity as the most fatal seductive lie that has yet existed, for promoting the idea that compassion and morality are superior to physical strength. By contrast, he argued, nature favors the ruthless and the powerful. The beast of prey and the jungle prove that evil can be very healthy and develop its body magnificently. Only the warrior is truly free. He equated democracy and mediocrity, degradation, and the diminution of those whose strength of purpose should allow them to rule over the weak and live beyond the constraints of human concepts such as good and evil. Carried away by his vision of rampant self-determination, he described the magnificent blonde beast of German manhood, roaming wantonly in search of prey and victory. It was a phrase he lived to regret. Another was his call for an end to democracy, and the establishing of a new order under the Master of Masses, one who will dominate and rule Europe. Frightening individual will bring an end to the long spun out comedy of little states, as well as democratic many wildness. The time for politics is past. The next century will bring the battle for the domination of the earth. For all his urging of youth to throw off the shackles of conformity, he feared unlimited state control, and anti-Semitism made him physically sick. It is a matter of honor with me to be absolutely clean and unequivocal in relation to anti-Semitism, namely opposed to it, as I am in my writings. He also fiercely against German nationalism. Behold the Germans, the lowest, most stupid, most common race that exists on earth. Such sentiments were overlooked by the volunteers and conscripts who poured over also Sprach Zarathustra in the mud of Flanders from 1914 and 1918. One line in particular no doubt escaped their notice. In prophesying the appearance of the Master of Masses, Nietzsche had referred to him as the last man, because he would be the one to initiate Armageddon, and this last man he described as the most despicable. Twilight of the Gods. When I hear Wagner, it seems to me that I hear rhythms of a bygone world. Imagine to myself that one day science will discover, in the waves set in motion by the ring-cold, secret mutual relations connected with the order of the world. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. Wagner provided the musical setting for Hitler's vision of German global domination. His epic melodramas are a granite monument in music to the grandeur of Aryan superiority and sacrifice. Without Wagner's Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, tempered with pastoral interludes, Nazism would not have acquired its mythic undertones. Both Theodore Roos, a practitioner of tantric sex magic, and Sar Laudon, a French writer on the occult, believed that Wagner was an intuitive magician. By drawing on Platonic mythology and its Aryan archetypes, Wagner was able to attribute heroic qualities to German manhood and motherhood while demonizing their enemies. Parsifal, for example, which celebrated Christian mysticism in the Late of the Night's Search for the Holy Grail, was conceived as a sacred mystery play, a musical rite to be experienced rather than simply enjoyed as high art. Wagner stressed its secondary or occult function by insisting performances be restricted to the Opera House of Bayreuth, which later became a place of pilgrimage for Wagner connoisseurs who wished to share the sacrament with the composer. Hitler acknowledged the magical element in the music when he remarked, "For me, Wagner is something godly, and his music is my religion. I go to his concerts as others go to church." When listening to Parsifal, Hitler admitted to be transported into an extraordinary state, a mystical dream world, in which he could endure the tensions of his turbulent nature. In contrast to Nietzsche, Richard Wagner, 1813–83, was an instinctive anti-Semite with no intellectual basis for his beliefs. His anti-Semitism erupted from professional jealousy. He despised his contemporaries, Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer, because he thought their music was frivolous, but he wasn't shrewd or sensible enough to criticize them for this. Instead, he attacked them on the basis of their religion, as if the shallowness of their music was indicative of their race. Wagner believed that he could establish a national cultural identity by creating great German art, which would be an expression of the national spirit and its ideals. He thought that he could only do this if he purged German art of its impurities, by which he meant the Jewish element. In an effort to achieve this, he adopted right-wing rhetoric and his countrymen's ingrained suspicion of the outsider by pointing an accusing finger at the Jews, whom he denounced as the embodiment of the abstract forces of modernity and social disintegration, which exemplified everything he considered alien to the German soul. His interminable, rambling essays on race, politics, and art had as deep and lasting an influence on Hitler's as did his music, prompting one commentator to liken his pernicious essay, Judaism in Music, to the lighted match an arsonist will toss into a room soaked with petrol. Wagner made it socially acceptable for educated Germans to be anti-Semitic, and that alone damns him in the minds of many who cannot hear his music without recalling its more sinister associations. Chapter 2: The Spear of Destiny. Though he, who has boldly risen from the abyss through an iron will and cunning, may conquer half the world, at the abyss he must return. Already a terrible fear has seized him. In vain he will resist, and all who still stand with him will perish in his fall. Goethe, The Awakening of Epimenes. Act 2, Scene 4. On an overcast afternoon in early autumn 1913, a grim-faced, wretched-looking youth stood shivering outside the Hofburg Museum in Vienna's historical Heldenplatz, with his sketchbook, and watched as first spots of rain blurred his latest watercolor. At the time, Adolf Hitler was 19, practically destitute, and in a state of almost constant despair. He had failed to gain admission to Vienna's prestigious Academy of Fine Arts, or to the City School of Architecture, and was reduced to sharing a shabby single room with a childhood friend in a squalid part of the city. His dead mother's savings were almost spent, and he had little prospect of earning a living from selling his postcard-sized pictures. Vienna's bourgeois shunned peddlers, and, besides, Hitler's sketches were crude and characterless. He was suddenly forced to face the fact that his hopes of becoming an architect and being entrusted with rebuilding the capital were nothing more than the wishful daydreams of youth. If he was to avoid becoming another vagrant on the streets of Vienna, he needed inspiration and a keen sense of purpose. He was to find both that afternoon in the most unlikely of places. The Hofburg Museum was a dull mausoleum dedicated to the past glories of Habsburg dynasty, which Hitler despised. As far as the future Führer was concerned, they symbolized the old, regenerate aristocracy who had denied their German origins. As the rain clouds opened, he reluctantly sought refuge among the relics of Austria's imperialist past. According to crypto-historian Trevor Ravenscroft, author of the highly questionable but often quoted Spear of Destiny 1972, Hitler paid scant attention to the exhibits as he walked through the musty, ill-lit galleries, hung with dark oil paintings in ornate gold frames and lined with artifacts in glass cabinets. In the Schatzkammer, or treasure house, he paused before a display of ancient relics known collectively as Reichklenoden, unaware of the significance of what he was looking at. So deep was he in his own thoughts. It was only when a tour guide began to address a party of foreign visitors that crowded around him that Hitler was awakened from his reverie. The guide pointed to an ancient spearhead, and then I heard the words which were to change my whole life. There is a legend associated with this spear that whoever claims it and solves its secrets holds the destiny of the world in his hands, for good or evil. The spearhead, known officially as the Sword of St. Maurice, was rumored to be the Holy Lance, or spear of Longinus, with which a Roman centurion had pierced the side of Jesus before he was taken down from the cross after his crucifixion. For this reason it was deemed to possess magical properties and was thereafter known as the Spear of Destiny. Charlemagne, 742 through 814, the first Holy Roman Emperor, was said to have attributed his unbroken string of victories to his possession of this spear. He died shortly after it had fallen from his hand, when his horse had reared and thrown him to the ground. A similar fate befell the 12th century German conqueror, Frederick Barbarossa, who dropped the spear while crossing a river in Asia Minor, and was immediately struck down and killed. In between, no fewer than 45 emperors had carried it before them, ensuring victory on the battlefield and in the Senate. Considering its bloody and illustrious history, it appeared at first glance to be an unremarkable object. The rust-encrusted leaf-shaped blade had been crudely repaired with wire and lay within an open leather case on a red velvet dais. Had it not been for the tiny crosses of gold embossed on the base, it would have been indistinguishable from hundreds of similar spears of the period held by museums around the world. There was no proof that the relic on display in Hofburg Museum was the genuine article, but that did not seem to deter Hitler, who later claimed that he experienced a revelation when he first came into its presence. He later wrote, "I knew with immediacy that this was an important moment in my life. And yet I could not divine why an outwardly Christian symbol should make such an impression upon me. I stood there quietly gazing upon it for several minutes, quite oblivious to the scene and the Schatzkammer around me. It seemed to carry some hidden inner meaning which evaded me, a meaning which I felt I inwardly knew, yet could not bring to consciousness. The spear appeared to be some sort of magical medium of revelation, for it brought the world of ideas into such close and living perspective that human imagination became more real than the world of sense. I felt as though I myself had held it in my hands before in some earlier century of history, that I myself had once claimed it as my talisman of power, and held the destiny of the world in my hands. Yet how could this be possible? What sort of madness was this that was invading my mind and creating such turmoil in my breast? Whether the spear was the genuine article or not is almost irrelevant. Clearly Hitler had awakened something within himself which was to empower him with a sense of his own destiny and infallibility. Hitler traces the history of the spear. The following morning, Hitler visited the Hof library to learn as much as he could about the spear, its legend, and its history, although he was too indolent to read anything other than magazines and Zimroman, sentimental novels, in adulthood. He had apparently been an avid, if indiscriminate, reader in his youth. With his school friend August Zubizek is to be believed. Books were his whole world. In Vienna he used the Hof library so industriously that I asked him once, in all seriousness, whether he intended to read the whole library, which, of course, earned some rude remarks. One day he took me along to the library and showed me the reading room. I was almost overwhelmed by the enormous masses of books, and I asked him how it was managed to get what he wanted. He began to explain to me the use of the various catalogues, which confused me even more. To his dismay, Hitler discovered that numerous conquerors had claimed to possess the Heilig, or victory lance, concurrently through the centuries, and that there was no certain way of proving whether the artifact in Schatzkammer was authentic. The first written reference of the Hofburg spear appeared in the ancient Saxon Chronicle, recording the Battle of Lech, in which Otto the Great triumphed over the Mongols. But prior to this, its origin were unknown. According to the crypto-historian Trevor Ravenscroft, author of The Spear of Destiny, Hitler returned later that afternoon to the Schatzkammer for a second look at the object, for it now obsessed him. I slowly became aware of a mighty presence around it, the same awesome presence which I had experienced inwardly on those rare occasions in my life when I had sensed that great destiny awaited me. Ravenscroft fails to provide a source for these quotations, and one is forced to ask if this melodramatic scene, and perhaps the bulk of the book, is purely speculative fiction. However, let us assume for a moment that this account has some basis in fact. As the author claimed, in this altered state of awareness, Hitler is said to have been privileged to the realization that the spear was a portal between the worlds of spirit and matter. The air became stifling, so that I could barely breathe. The noisy scene of the treasure house seemed to melt away before my eyes. I stood alone and trembling before the hovering form of the Superman, Übermensch, a spirit sublime and fearful, a countenance intrepid and cruel. In holy awe I offered my soul as a vessel of his will. And then came the vision which decided his destiny. A window in the future was opened up to me, through which I saw in a single flash of illumination a future event by which I knew beyond contradiction that the blood in my veins would one day become the vessel of the folk spirit of my people. It is thought that the revelation Hitler referred to was a vision of the future in which he saw himself entering Vienna in triumph on the day Austria was assimilated into the Reich on March 12, 1938. In a speech before the ecstatic crowds celebrating Anschluss in the Austrian capital, he appeared to refer to that same vision when he said, "Providence has charged me with a mission to reunite the German peoples. I have lived for it, and I believe I have now fulfilled it." And it was on that day that he ordered the removal of the Habsburg regalia to Germany aboard an armored train. Enter Dr. Stein. The source for these intimate episodes was not Hermann Röschning, the minor Nazi official who it is alleged fraudulently claimed to have been privy to Hitler's innermost thoughts, leading several generations of historians astray, but an even more inconspicuous figure, Dr. Walter Johann Stein, 1891 to 1957. Stein was a respected Viennese doctor of philosophy and anthroposophist, a follower of Rudolf Steiner. He was said to have been employed as a confidential advisor to Winston Churchill after fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe in 1933 in order to escape being pressed into service by Himmler's Occult Bureau. As with Louis de Wohl, the astrologer, Dr. Stein was apparently considered to be of value to the British, who were keen for inside knowledge on the Führer's mental state so that they could anticipate his future strategies, but were also curious to discover what occult methods the Nazis were employing to locate vulnerable Allied convoys. According to Ravenscroft, the Prime Minister swore Stein to secrecy regarding the extent to which the British used physics, psychics in spying and self-defense, but in the summer of 1957, Stein decided that he had kept the secret long enough and that it was time to tell the truth. 3 days later he collapsed and he died soon afterwards. Fortunately for Ravenscroft, Stein had earlier confided in him after the author had initially sought out the academic in a matter of mutual interest, the Holy Grail. But with Stein silenced, there is now no way of corroborating Ravenscroft's account of Hitler's mystical experiences, or the part Stein may have played in Britain's psychic self-defense. That said, it is worth repeating, for truth is often stranger than fiction. The face at the window. The beast does not look what he is. He may even have a comic mustache. Vladimir Solovyov, the Antichrist. In the summer of 1912, Walter Stein was starting his second semester at Vienna University, where he was studying for a science doctorate. It was an intensive course, and Stein had to ration his free time. When he found he could afford to take a break, he would spend it browsing through the musty antiquarian bookshops in the old quarter of the city near the banks of Danube. At the back of one ill-let shop, he is said to have chanced upon an annotated leather-bound copy of Wolfram von Eschenbach's epic prose poem, Parzival, annotated with insights and comments by someone who evidently had a thorough knowledge of their subject and more than a passing acquaintance with occult philosophy. Stein had been searching for a copy of the book ever since his parents had taken him to see Wagner's opera based on the same medieval legend of the knight's search for the Holy Grail. His researchers had led him to conclude that the medieval Grail romance was based on historical figures of the 9th century, and that the Holy Lance was not symbolic but an actual physical relic. But the book was a real find. He gladly paid the asking price and left the shop eager to examine his treasure. A few streets further on, he took a window seat at Demille's fashionable cafe with a view of Kohlmarkt, and read the slender book from cover to cover in a single sitting. It became evident that the author of the hastily scrawled commentary had discovered a key to deciphering the secrets of the Grail legend encoded in the Knight's Quest. But while more enlightened readers would be ready to interpret the stages of the quest as trials of initiation, the previous owner had taken it as a confirmation of his belief in the superiority of the Aryan race. The marginalia revealed that their author despised the Christian ideal and possessed a working knowledge of the black arts. By the time Stein closed the book, we are told, he realized he had been reading the footnotes of Satan. Little did Stein suspect that within the hour he would come face to face with its diabolical author, in a moment more contrived than a scene from the Mills and Boon romantic novel. We are asked to believe that Stein then looked up from his book to gaze into the face of its starving, wild-eyed author, looking hungrily through the window at the rich Viennese gorging themselves on cream cakes and coffee. Hitler was dressed in a greasy, threadbare black overcoat several sizes too large and frayed trousers. His toes could be seen poking through the cracks in his shoes like a caricature of Charlie Chaplin. In fact, one suspects that Chaplin provided Ravenscroft with the inspiration for his tragicomic scene rather than Stein. When Stein left the cafe, the vagrant with the grizzled hair and comical mustache was still lingering in the coal mart, selling his postcard-sized watercolors. On impulse, Stein pressed a handful of marks into the artist's hand and accepted 3 sketches unseen before making his way back to his lodgings. There he laid them out beside the book that he had engrossed in the cafe. It was only then that Stein noticed that the subject of one of the watercolors was the Heilig lance as pictured on display in Hofburg. Then he saw something which made the hair on the nape of his neck stand up. The signature of the artist and name of the previous owner of the noted Parzival were one and the same, Adolf Hitler. Quite apart from the ludicrously contrived coincidences which characterized Ravenscroft's account, there are a number of factual anomalies which raise serious doubts as to the veracity of the events recorded in the Spear of Destiny. For example, when Dr. Stein inquired where he might find Hitler, the bookseller mentioned that he had left Vienna to claim an inheritance from a recently deceased aunt. This was purportedly in the summer of 1912, but the only recently deceased aunt in the family was Johanna Holtz, who had died the previous spring. Secondly, recent research has failed to find evidence of either Ernst Pritsch or his shop, which one would expect to have been preserved in the city's meticulously kept archive, although there is the possibility that these records there might have been destroyed in the war. But more significantly, doubts have been raised by the suspicious similarities between Ravenscroft's accounts of Steiner's discovery of the annotated Parzival pamphlet and an almost identical episode in Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton's occult novel Zanoni, 1842, which raises the question of whether Ravenscroft was inspired by the novel or whether it is simply an uncanny coincidence. And then there's the highly dubious presumption that someone who had annotated a book with personal comments and clues as to the work's true meaning would have been foolish enough to part with it in the first place. Most curious of all, though, is the fact that we are asked to believe that Dr. Stein, a well-educated middle-class Jew, sought out a rabid anti-Semite, whose hatred of Jews was evident from his crude, vulgar, and in many cases obscene handwritten comments in the margins of Parzival, even allowing for the unlikely possibility that he was desperate to share his passion for the Grail legend with a fellow seeker. These doubts in themselves do not, of course, automatically discredit the story, but once seemingly serious flaws such as these are identified, the whole edifice begins to look decidedly unsound. And then there is the assertion, made recently by German journalist Christopher Leidenberg in Die Drei, who found several significant inconsistencies in Ravenscroft's account, and who states no time of life did Hitler live in impoverished conditions. Rather, he always had sufficient money. In the Meldenmannstrasse, a kind of large hotel, he paid a rent of 15 kronen a month, so he could afford a fairly expensive room and had no need to sell his pictures. However, let's give Ravenscroft the benefit of the doubt and see how far he asks us to suspend our disbelief. In Search of Hitler. In the following days, we are told, Stein went in search of an itinerant artist but could find no trace of him. Eventually, he returned to Ernst Press shop and asked the proprietor if he could supply Hitler's address. Pretzsch, an odious, balding, toad-like man, informed him that Hitler had not been in for more than 3 weeks, but he believed that he frequently stayed at the hostelry on Mellemanstrasse. Seeing how eager the young student was to learn more about the author of The Marginalia, Pretzsch invited him to step into a small back room. There he told Stein how he would occasionally cook for Hitler, who was always in need of food but was too proud to accept money. Hitler would pawn his books when he was truly desperate, and Pretzsch would pay a few hellers to save him from sleeping in the street. This is the myth Hitler created for himself, and which others were to embellish. The impoverished future hero, the misunderstood messiah, suffering indignities and physical hardship for his people in the back streets of Vienna. It is a fabricated self-image, symptomatic of a neurotic, paranoid personality, which seeks to justify feelings of fear and rage by assuming the role of victim in order to have others rush to the rescue and offer reassurance. One can imagine Hitler learning the role from his doting mother, with whom he fled whenever his authoritarian father became abusive. The truth of the Vienna years was far more mundane. Recent research suggests that Hitler never saw the inside of a flophouse, nor did he share a bug-infested apartment with his school friend Kubizek. An inheritance from his Aunt Johanna Poltz and his father's modest civil service pension allowed him to live in comparative comfort during these missing years, which he spent lying in bed until mid-morning, just as he was later to do at Berchtesgaden, then venturing out to sell his watercolors and clothes that may not have been tailor-made, but were of sufficient quality at least to give the lie to the image of an emaciated Viennese vagrant. So zealously did Hitler preserve this mythology and mythologized self-image that he even risked alienating his supporters in the early years of the party. Some were so incensed by their leader's pathological need for secrecy, they circulated a leaflet among the members expressing their concerns, including their suspicion that he was sponsored by silent partners who decided to dictate party policy. He regards the time as ripe for bringing dissension and schism into our ranks by means of the shadowy people behind him. It grows more and more clear that his purpose is simply to use the National Socialist Party for his own immoral purposes. A further point is the question of his occupation and finances. If ever individual members inquire what he actually lives on and what his previous occupation has been, he always gets excited and loses his temper. We're not skipping pages here. Conrad Hayden, a Munich journalist and author of The History of National Socialism, 1932, and Birth of the Third Reich, 1934, noted, "The man is by nature secretive. His life does not lie open to his friends. Questions regarding his private affairs offend him. Unsettled and embarrassed by intellectually superior people and those who were not afraid to speak their minds, he would start ranting in an effort to disguise paucity of his argument, or relapse into the sullen sulk." When detailing Stein's second visit to the bookshop in Vienna, Ravenscroft describes Pretzsch pointing out a pile of books that Hitler had pawned, including works by Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. But again, there's no proof that this event ever took place, and considerable reliable testimony to suggest that it did not. As has already been noted, Hitler had no interest in serious literature. Those who knew him personally have stated that he would reread the same adolescent adventure stories over and over, and was even given the quoting passages to impress guests to the Reich's chancellery and at Berchtesgaden. His favorite novels were those by Karl May, the author of a series of Native American adventure stories in the Fenimore Cooper vein, and a series of books concerning the Schmalzig adventures of a horse called robots. Presumably, he resisted the temptation to recite these from memory when entertaining educated foreign dignitaries. When table talk tired him, he would indulge his petite bourgeois tastes in entertainment with frivolous romantic film comedies provided by the ever-obliging Goebbels. Such a picture is clearly in stark contrast to Ravenscroft's image of the feverishly intellectual novice magician poring over the world's health and wealth of occult philosophy. If there is any doubt as to which is the truer picture, it should be noted that Hitler's private secretary, Christa Schroeder, affirmed his library contained no classic and no single book of humane or intellectual value. Meanwhile, Hitler himself admitted to his intellectual limitations when he said, "I read to confirm my ideas." Even his school friend, Kubizek, who had been such a heroic image of the young Hitler at the Hof Library, later admitted in a private letter to the Linz archivist, Franz Wetzinger, that there were only 2 books that Hitler had actually read with enthusiasm: A Child's Guide to Nordic Mythology and A History of German Archaeology, in which he had discovered the symbol that was to cast its shadow over Europe, the swastika. See, I thought they said earlier in the book, too, that it was on a stained glass where he went to school, and not in this book. I do not know. Something new has been added. Ravenscroft's Spear of Destiny appears to belong to the same literary genre that gave rise to the Da Vinci Code, works of highly speculative fiction featuring historical characters. As such, we have to take following events he describes in Pretsch's shop as a possible, if unlikely, scenario rather than as historical fact. While the proprietor probed Stein for personal details and his political sympathies, the student surveyed the chaotically cramped room which served as Pretsch's office. He noted a number of prints illustrating chemical processes and astrological crafts, alongside anti-Semitic cartoons of a pornographic nature. While Pretsch pressed his questions, Stein studied a group photograph on the desk in which his interrogator was shown beside Guido von List, the pan-German mystic who had been accused of practicing satanic sexual magic and who Ravenscroft falsely alleged had been run out of Vienna by an outraged populace. In truth, von List was a dreamer, an armchair Armanist, who advocated a return to nature and the worship of Wotan. He was obsessed with the occult significance of runic symbols and wrote long-learned treatises on the subject which were profound influence on Himmler, but he was no Aleister Crowley. Reich, however, considered himself an adept of the dark arts and offered to initiate Stein into the arcane mysteries. I am considered in some quarters to be a great authority on occultism. He is said to have boasted Adolf Hitler is not the only person to whom I give assistance and advice in these matters. Firmly, but politely refusing the offer, Stein hurried out of the shop and made his way to the hostelry, where he was informed that Herr Hitler had left the city to claim a small inheritance from an aunt who had died at Spittel an der Drah. The manager did not expect Hitler to return. It was to be another 10 days before Stein happened to see Hitler painting outside the Hofburg and noted the remarkable improvement in his appearance. Hitler resisted the stranger's awkward attempt to engage in conversation. He didn't seek approval for his art, and nor was he moved by a young student's assertion that they shared a common interest in the spear. Not, that is, until Stein mentioned that he, too, had unearthed proof from a German chronicle in Cologne that the Holy Lance was the Teutonic origin. Hitler's eyes blazed into life. Little did he suspect that his fellow enthusiast, with his classic Aryan looks, was actually a Jew. Together they entered the Schatzkammer and stood before the display case in which the spear was housed. Lost in contemplation, Stein, we are asked to believe, was overcome with a vision of the crucified Christ in the presence of his sacred